G'day folks, Sapper here with another World of Warships video. Welcome to In Depth, a series with theory crafting and analysis where we see how deep the rabbit hole can get. A few years ago, submarines entered public testing and I made a pledge to cover them once they were close to release. Well, it took a bloody while, but here we are. German and United States submarines have been released with a couple of premiums briefly available through crates. In this video, I'm not going to cover every little issue or gripe about submarines. However, I am going to identify what I think are the larger issues, what could potentially be done to improve them, and how things may progress with the ship type if they aren't. Straight up, I always try to keep my biases out of my analysis, and where I have them, I like to own them. So while I'm approaching this subject as objectively as possible, you need to know that I'm not a fan of submarines. But I also don't have a hate boner for them either. Before we get any further, don't forget to hit the subscribe and notification buttons if you want to see more of my content. Submarines are different to other ship types and have more complicated mechanics. Generally, their traits and mechanics are as follows: guided torpedoes via an aimed ping system, unguided torpedo option from Tier 8, an ability to travel underwater at 3 different depths, periscope, 30 metres and 60 metres. Underwater travel uses up oxygen supply, and the oxygen slowly recovers when on the surface. Reduced surface detection at periscope depth. Invisible while submerged at 30 or 60 metres. Radar only detects submarines on the surface. Hydroacoustic search detects submarines at 30 and 60 metres, but only to a distance of 2 kilometres. Normal distance applies to surface and periscope depth. Submarine surveillance consumable that hard detects enemy submarines with a range of between 6 and 9 kilometres. The range varies depending on the submarine. Hydrophone consumable that provides periodic silhouette of enemy ships and submarines on the surface or at periscope depth with a range of between 6 and 9 kilometres. Again, range varies depending on the submarine. And very little or no anti-aircraft armament. As you can see, submarine systems are complicated, so it should come as no surprise that many players find playing against them frustrating. The key issues I have with submarines stem from these traits and mechanics. Number 1. Submarine spotting conditions and rules are overly complicated. Number 2. Submarines are too difficult to zone or catch out. And number 3. Submarines are very niche in their effective role. And these 3 things all tie together. There are many other issues, for example, dolphining, which is the act of using surface and periscope concealment values to get close to a target to launch torpedoes. In my opinion, issues like dolphining are minor in comparison to things such as the complexity of the spotting conditions. And the spotting conditions are a foundation of the game and affect a higher percentage of situations. World of Warships is defined and often criticised for overly simplified systems. Even 3 years on, aircraft carrier automated damage control party still sees the occasional meme. And complexity is the biggest of the key issues in my view. The spotting conditions and rules for submarines have so many exceptions to the existing global rules. For example, hydroacoustic search ship acquisition range. For submarines, it only detects them at 2 kilometres when they're submerged. These different rules adjustments are probably implemented in order to give submarines more of an ability to remain in stealth and survive while positioning closer to the enemy. And they probably do make submarines easier to play. But the second order effect is that most players don't know these rules or conditions, and submarines become frustrating to play against. We can see that frustration in the forums, from content creators, on the subreddit, or in various Discord channels. The spotting rules for submarines are not intuitive compared to interactions between other ship types. To improve these interactions, I think hydroacoustic search should detect submarines at its ship detection range, with a possible exception for submarines at maximum depth. On the other hand, maybe treat submarine detection with the torpedo detection range. For ships without access to hydroacoustic search, most have some sort of plane consumable. Maybe empower these ships to minimap detect submarines out to their air detection range. I think some consideration should also be made for surveillance radar detecting submarines at periscope depth, giving surface ships a little bit more time to target a submarine. Regardless, I think there is definitely room for improvement around spotting. These types of changes also assist with my second key gripe, the difficulty in zoning out submarines. By improving hydro and plane capability, it would give surface ships more agency to catch out a submarine and be proactive in countering them, rather than simply waiting for a submarine to make a mistake. Consider the risks involved in pushing a submarine. Why shouldn't a submarine that has mispositioned suffer severe repercussions, like any other ship type? And while these changes do not solve all the complexities around spotting submarines, at least the consumables that players are experienced with are consistent and have functionality. My final bugbear is that all of the different traits and mechanics mean that submarines are very niche in their effective role. At their most basic, submarines function similar to torpedo destroyers, doing well against static or predictable enemies and providing spotting. However, torpedo destroyers are also effective when retreating from an enemy push and are able to find different angles with which to torpedo an advancing enemy. Submarines do not function well running away, although the US and German Tier 10s are somewhat better by being fast underwater. Generally though, submarines are slower in the water even at surface speed. They have limited torpedo arcs and a forward-facing firepower focus. They are by no means useless in this situation, but are much less effective than most destroyers. And there's nothing wrong with niche ships. Niche roles can be a lot of fun to play. I genuinely enjoy playing Italian destroyers, for example. But it doesn't change the fact that the more niche a ship is, the more likely it is to have a limited impact on a wider variety of battles or conditions. And submarines are the most niche ship type in the game, particularly in regards to combat effectiveness. While they do have the potential to impact the outcome of a battle, I found that they are very prone to being relegated to solely a spotting role. And the issue with this niche combat power is that it will without a doubt impact their popularity. And when a ship type becomes rare, the player base's collective knowledge on how to effectively play against them begins to disappear. We saw this several years ago in the dying months of the RTS aircraft carriers. Players got more used to playing in a static manner. This contributed to a rude awakening in the months and patches following the rework, particularly in view of a shift away from AA and towards mobility and allies as the counterplay. But how are things now? Currently, we have begun to see players adapt to the new ship type and get better at countering submarines. However, there are conditions and times where there isn't much that surface ship players can do. While some of my suggestions could improve things, it would also have the effect of making submarines harder to play, and that's not a good thing for a ship type that is already very niche. There are some things that could be adjusted to give submarines a little more agency to balance out my suggested changes. A good start would be an improved standard torpedo armament with better range or a focus on that weapon system. Or something else like maybe improving ASW effectiveness but giving submarines a heal. Perhaps submarines could function as a standoff torpedo threat instead of being hybrid torpedo destroyers. In this sense, they could sit between destroyers and cruisers in a conventional team layout. Maybe submarines could be viewed as a ship that should form a symbiotic relationship with a destroyer and be adjusted accordingly. Early on in the testing, this was the avenue I thought most promising. A submarine that helps a destroyer against an enemy destroyer, and in turn, that destroyer assists the submarine with the enemy submarine. In and around such a tug of war could be strikes on capital ships. At the very least, I do think there needs to be some harder limits on how many submarines and destroyers can be on a team, as when they are in high numbers, I found the game to be more frustrating than double aircraft carrier matchups, and that's saying something. I really do hope that some of the suggestions I've outlined in this video could be a reality, but I think it's very unlikely. There are many things that could be improved that I haven't mentioned in this video, as I wish to focus on what I saw were the key issues. A good example is ASW inconsistency between ships. I'm not sure why Alexander Nevsky shoots depth charges out its bow without any UI feedback. That legitimately lost me a game earlier this year. Ultimately though, submarines are here, and it doesn't appear that wargaming is going to make any more significant changes to them. And while I'm not a fan of playing against submarines, I can honestly say that after playing them a fair bit, I found myself understanding how to counter them better and had far less of an issue with them. But that's part of the issue, isn't it? Most players shouldn't need to play submarines to learn how to counter them or understand them at a basic level. Submarines aren't quite as bad as I had feared, but at the same time, the reason I have less of an issue with them than I expected is because of just how niche they are. And long term, I think their nicheness is going to be a tricky issue for players and for the wider game. What do you think are the key issues around submarines though? Moving forward, do you think it's all doom and gloom or that players will adapt? I think players will mostly adapt, but that it will take time. But I've been wrong before. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's given you something to think about. Take care, stay healthy, and I'll catch you in the next one.